Hello, everyone. So in a recent stream on their podcast by Ethan and Hila Klein of H3H3 Productions, they engaged in fairly blatant denialism of the Palestinian Nakba of 1948, where around 800,000 Palestinians were killed or expelled by Israeli/Jewish forces, and they also spread a very common pro-Israel propaganda narrative, that is, the narrative that Jews were systematically expelled en masse from what is usually described as Muslim or Arab countries during or immediately following these events. The idea behind this is to create like a sort of proportionality between these two events, the Jewish expulsion of the Palestinians and the flight, exodus, and expulsion of Jews from other Middle Eastern nations, where the latter supposedly cancels out and legitimizes the former. The issue is that this argument, even on its own terms, simply doesn't hold up, and it especially doesn't hold up on a factual basis when you actually look at what occurred and why. So I'm going to use the denialism and spreading of false Zionist propaganda by these two to create sort of a teaching moment about these events. The Nakba, which most people watching probably already know about, but the narrative surrounding so-called Jewish expulsions that followed is something that has not really been talked about nearly as much, in large part because people are afraid of false anti-Semitism allegations regarding it. Now, let's begin with Ethan's narrative about what happened in 1948. And I will explain in depth, though this is going to be a largely off-the-cuff video. I do have all of this committed to memory, so I will be citing my sources in post-production as I go along. I will be explaining how this is a Zionist propaganda narrative, how he's erasing the Nakba, how everything that he is saying here serves to legitimize, at least in the eyes of the Israelis, the eyes of their propaganda, and the eyes of their allies, pretty much all of the things that Israel does to the Palestinians, and really the very existence of Israel as what it is, which is a state that affords exclusive special privileges to one group of people at the expense of another group of people, based on what the state views as innate traits that they supposedly hold. So let's watch.
You want to know what the ultimate irony is? 1948, the War of Independence is called in Israel. Others know it as the Arab-Israeli War.
So I just want to note here that Ethan gave this supposed war two names there, but he missed one, the Nakba. And the Nakba is a very relevant and very apt name, because the fact of the matter is that when this supposed war happened, the Palestinians had no real organization, no real funding, no really significant armed groups or leadership to protect them to fight back against the Zionist colonists, while the Zionist colonists had, for a very long time, organized terrorist groups, militias, etc. among them, which were extremely well funded by international organizations that they had formed, which were dedicated to funding and fomenting the Zionist colonization of Palestine. Hence, what Ethan Klein calls a war here actually started out as mass killings and expulsions by an organized military against the people who did not have one. The Nakba, contrary to the narrative of Ethan and Hila here, began before the intervention of the nearby Middle Eastern Arab states. It was a reaction to it, in fact. By the time of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, more than half of the people who were expelled in the Nakba had already been expelled. After
the partition plan to split the Palestine into a part Arab, part Jewish, as many of you probably know, every Arab country around Israel waged a war of annihilation.
Okay, so Ethan left the Nakba out of his narrative here entirely. That is absolutely inexcusable. It's like leaving the Holocaust out of World War II. It simply cannot be forgiven. It is abhorrent, honestly. It's the only way that his narrative can really hold up here as well. Two is that he presents the partition plan as if it was something that had been agreed upon by all sides. But the fact of the matter is that the UN partition plan was approved by the UN only following incessant lobbying by the US government and by extremely well-funded Zionist organizations. The UN at the time was a very small body. Most countries in the world were not represented there. The process did not involve the actual participation of the Palestinians, who had been there longer than the new arrivals, and who had always been against this idea that their country should be partitioned in two on an ethnic basis between themselves and people, most of whom had only started arriving in there in significant numbers in the previous decades. The Israelis, too, officially had never accepted nor implemented the partition plan. They never abided by its terms in any way, shape, or form. One can simply ask basic questions about this, like, has Israel ever respected the fact that the partition plan called for the establishment of two states? Have they respected the borders that it laid out? Have they respected the fact that it never legitimized the mass expulsions that they engaged in? No, there is in fact not a single term of the conditions in the plan that they actually engaged in. And irrespective of that, this idea that the Palestinians are wrong for not accepting the plan in the first place is incredibly questionable in of itself. You can see that Ethan Klein presents it as if it is sort of self-evidently true. Like, he does not even question the notion. He's just like, there was this plan for partition. I guess that was it, right? Who cares what the people who had been living there before all of these new Jewish colonists had started arriving thought about it? Who cares about the fact that they had never agreed to it in any capacity? Who cares about the fact that an international body, which at the time was incredibly small, comprising only 56 countries, and being dominated by the US and its allies, had some sort of special right to just declare to these people that more than half of their country was to be given over to Jewish people to form their own exclusive ethno-state. The very premise behind it is obviously flawed, and presenting their partition plan as if it was not clearly a grave injustice is a rhetorical trick to then sort of implant this idea that what Israel did was legitimate. They were just abiding by the plan, apparently, even though they broke every single thing that was stipulated in it, and that it is the fault of the Palestinians for rejecting obviously untenable things like this, rather than just giving up more than half of their country to new arrivals for their own exclusive use. And it's especially ironic that Zionists love to cite the partition plan as somehow legitimizing when they reject, like, literally every other UN prescription or decision, binding or not, ever made on the subject of Israel-Palestine aside from it. Like the UN resolution passed in 1948, telling Israel to let the people that they had expelled return to their homes. Very few people watching this right now would accept the same sort of thing imposed upon them. The idea of this partition plan, presented as legitimate even though Palestinians had never agreed to it, even though Israel immediately broke every single one of its tenets, as neutral, serves to legitimize what Israel immediately did afterwards. It is a Zionist propaganda narrative, one of the many that Ethan and Hila have presented to their audience as if they were simply true by virtue of them having said so. Let us continue.
To basically prevent the state from being formed. Mm-hmm. Now, there's different ranges of people, who say like, oh, they were going to kill all the Jews, or I doubt they were probably going to kill everybody, but I think they probably would have made them refugees. But whatever, it doesn't matter. They waged a war of extermination on Israel in 1948. Now, here's the ironic part about this all.
I'd like to bring up what I believe is actually the ironic part about this all. The ironic part about this all is that in 1948, there was one group who factually waged a war of annihilation, and it was the Jews, who subsequently became the Israelis, in Palestine against the non-Jewish population of Palestine. The Arab intervention was a reaction to that. Was a reaction to the expulsions and the killings of Palestinians by organized Jewish militias and terrorist organizations which had begun before the Israeli Declaration of Independence and which continued afterwards. Ethan and Zionists like to present this as if it was a war of annihilation waged against Jews for being Jews, when the fact of the matter is that, one, the partition plan itself was cover for the Zionist plan to get rid of what they conceived of as the Arab inhabitants of the land. This idea is so ingrained in Zionist thought and strategy that it was first articulated by Theodor Herzl, who will come up here later as well, who was the most important Zionist political theorist of the late 19th century, and who has been officially declared as the father of the nation by the State of Israel. Herzl's initial plan to get rid of the previous population of Palestine was to have the Jewish colonists use the fact that they had a very well-developed organizational structure, that they were very well-funded, and had lots of European/Western support to take control of the land by buying as much of it as they could. The idea was to buy farmland, homes, pretty much whatever they could get their hands on. Then they would refuse employment to non-Jews, thus forcing them to either leave, such as to Egypt, or to die of starvation. This idea of transfer from then on became ingrained into Zionist political thought until it was actually carried out in a much more violent way than even what Herzl had initially envisioned in practice in 1948. So there is one side here that had long planned an actual war of extermination, and it was the Jewish side. It was not the Palestinian one, it was not the Arab one. It was a side which, in its majority, was made up of very recent arrivals who, in their representative organizations, had planned to get rid of the previous population from the very beginning. For Ethan to frame the subsequent reaction of Arab states to this plan actually being carried out in practice finally in 1948 as extermination, without mentioning any of that, nor mentioning the fact that it was a reaction to this plan being carried out, can only be considered denialism. Erasure isn't strong enough of a word. It is denialism of the Nakba, denialism of all of the context surrounding the history of the formation of the State of Israel and surrounding the problem of Israel and Palestine. Only through acknowledging these sorts of facts can the goals for justice and the freedom of the Palestinian people, which Ethan sometimes pays lip service to, ever actually be obtained. Now let's see what else they have to say.
At that time, there was 1 million Jews living in the Arab and Muslim world. 1 million. These Jews that live in those countries for 2,000 plus years. Okay? When the war started, then anti-Semitism spiked greatly in the Arab and the Muslim world. And because of that, pretty much 99.9% of all the Jews in the Middle East were forced to leave their country under threat of violence to go to Israel. So in trying to prevent the state of Israel, they all became anti-Semitic, kicked all the Jews out, 1 million Jews, there was 1 million of them. And then they forced them to move to the only fucking place they could in the entire world, which was Israel.
This is a very common Zionist narrative, which Ethan and Hila clearly believe uncritically, which you would expect they are Israeli. One, the first thing to point out here that is by far the most important thing here is that this sort of narrative, perhaps this is not what Ethan meant to say about it, but nonetheless, this is the implication behind it. This is how it is usually used far more often than not, is this idea that all Arabs, all non-Israeli Middle Eastern states form like this one nation, this one people who were all collectively responsible for what happened to the Jews across them. Thus, the supposed expulsion of Jews from these states can sort of be blamed on the Palestinians. But the fact of the matter is, Palestine is not Egypt, Palestine is not Yemen, Palestine is not Morocco, Palestine is not Algeria, Palestine is not Sudan, Palestine is not Iraq, Palestine is not any other Middle Eastern country. It is Palestine. The Palestinians did not expel these people. They are not responsible for what was done to them, the facts of which we are about to go over, and it is incredibly misleading to frame this as some sort of symmetrical thing where one expulsion is legitimized or one expulsion cancels out the other, when the victims of the original expulsion, the Palestinians, are obviously not responsible for the actions of those states. Just like they are not responsible for the Holocaust, which is rhetorically used as a tool to legitimize Israel, even though the movement to found Israel, as I went over, began far before it had ever happened, and the leaders of that movement were long scheming to get rid of the Palestinians before they had even met one. Another thing is that the Jewish flight / immigration / expulsions, don't worry, I'll be justifying those labels soon, from those other Middle Eastern nations are not at all comparable to the Palestinian Nakba. And the reason for this is very simple, because those people came to Israel and they immediately moved into Palestinian land and homes. Palestinians, on the other hand, were expelled by the Jewish state, by Jewish terrorists, by Jewish militias, and they did not have the recently stolen homes and lands of another people to immediately move into. And yes, this was literally as direct as I'm saying it. These people quite literally immediately moved into towns that were founded on the ruins of Palestinian villages, or straight into Palestinian houses. So while some of them, not all of them, may have been victims of expulsions, they also immediately became the dispossessors of another people. Before I continue with more context here, I want to see what more Ethan has to say on the issue, just to make sure I don't miss anything.
It's so like ironic. It's like they fulfilling their own what's the word?
Prophecy.
Prophecy, yeah. And then these people They go to Israel, and then these same people are accusing them of cultural appropriating their own fucking culture.
Okay, so just in response to that last point, their own culture is Arab. Their own culture is Arab, right? So when we say that, this is so far from what I wanted to talk about here, but I'm just doing it while I can. So when we say Hamas is not Israeli, it's not that people are saying these people are not from Arab countries. It's that Israel as a nation literally claims Hamas. There have been cases, for example, where the Israeli state and the Israeli lobby literally have gotten the name changed of dishes when they are called like Palestinian couscous, for example. It is an appropriation for a nationalist project. And while we're on this point, I just want to note that this sort of homogenizing of Arab-Jewish identity into like one unified Israeli identity is where the cultural appropriation comes in. Arab Jews, when they arrived to Israel, were pretty much immediately put on this state-mandated course of Europeanization. This is why me even saying Arab Jew is something that would be controversial in Israel, because the very ideology of Israel is more Jewish, less Arab. And that conception of Jewish is European, not Mizrahi, as they call it. The very term Mizrahi is a creation of the Israeli state. It is only a few decades old, 40, 50 years old. These people were seen by the original Israeli governments as basically subhuman, as being too like the Arabs who they were oppressing, and that part of their identity was essentially beaten out of them over the decades, both literally, physically, and metaphorically, through propaganda, repression, what have you. So I agree with Ethan in part here. It's true that there are Arab Jews in Israel whose traditional food is just like the food that is eaten in many other Arab countries. But what's not true is to call this Israeli, because the Israeli state and its identity are artificial constructs of European Jews. In a country that is factually made up of people from many different places, as Israel is, it makes no sense to start claiming the food of these migrants as food of that country. I imagine Italians would also get angry if Americans started saying that pasta and pizza were theirs. As ingrained as that food is to actual American cuisine today, everyone knows it is not the origin of those dishes. But Israelis don't talk about hummus, for example, as if it is a dish of Arab origin that Israelis now consume as a result of migrants to Israel imparting that into this Israeli culture. No, they very much claim it as their own, and this is a part of what Ethan has been engaging in here, Palestinian erasure. The Palestinian Nakba doesn't even come up as a part of his narrative here. In its own small little way, the erasure of the Arabness of huge parts of so-called Israeli cuisine is due to the Israeli national ideology of proximity to Arab is bad, hence why they started denying the Arabness of the Middle Eastern Jews, and Arabs themselves are bad. So yeah, to reject Arabness to the extent that Israel does, to the point where it's basically a state ideology to such an extent that they not only oppress, kill, massacre, maim Arabs constantly, but even deny the Arabness of Arab Jews, and then have the audacity to apply the Israeli branding to Arab food, you see the problem, don't you? Now, I also wanted to touch on something else that Ethan said there, which is regarding Arab anti-Semitism and how this sort of played into the Israeli goals. And I agree with him there. In fact, Zionists have always considered anti-Semitism to be a great boon for themselves because Zionists do not like Jews. You have to understand this. Zionism is a national project that essentially negates a lot of previous Jewish identity. And Zionist European Jews, like Ethan Klein himself, hate people who they view as not conforming to this sort of new Jewish nationalist culture that they created.
Here we are in Nebra, and it's the home of the Jew, the Jewy Jew, not just this Jew like me or Hila, but this is home of the super Jew, the Jew, the dirty, grimy, jacket wearing Jews. Real dirty ass, nasty. You know what I mean? It's like, who can look more Jewish? Boom, boom, boom. It's like it doesn't end. I mean, come on.
So Theodor Herzl, who I introduced earlier, once wrote in a very famous quote, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends and the anti-Semitic countries our allies." The idea behind that quote is very simple, that anti-Semitism elsewhere helps Israel. Jewish peril elsewhere is an asset to Israel, because the more that Jews feel they are unsafe, that they need to leave the other countries that they live in, the higher the chance is that they will choose Israel as their destination. A Jew who does not live in Israel and who does not advocate for it is useless to the Zionist national project. A lot of anti-Semitism today, as you may have noticed, is a result of people looking at what Israel does and erroneously attributing it to all Jews. Israel couldn't give a shit about this, because when an Israeli soldier, he's not the one who is a possible victim of the anti-Semitism that may arise. When someone in some other country sees a news story about this, sees this incredibly important Jewish religious symbol carved into the belly of someone, and then takes the Israelis and their state at their word that they are the supposed representatives of the Jewish people, and then develops anti-Semitic thoughts because of that. If anything, that actually benefits Israel, because if that person goes out and yells anti-Semitic slurs at someone in the street, that Jew might think, I'm unsafe here, I need to go to Israel. They go there, they bring their assets there, they become a colonist for Zionism, they become a tool for Israel. Previously, they were near useless. Now, they are an asset to the Zionist national project. That is what Herzl meant there, with the anti-Semites being the Zionists' best allies, their best friends. And this principle also provides enlightening insight into what actually happened with what Ethan Klein calls the mass expulsion of 1 million Jews from the Middle East. To call it an expulsion is extremely inaccurate because the Israelis wanted those Jews to leave and to come to Israel, or at least some of them, because they considered them to be racially inferior. The Zionists in the early days of Israel, for example, spoke about which groups of Eastern Jews they considered to be desirable or not. The chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Jerusalem called Egyptian Jews a deadly plague. Confronted with the prospect of bringing Ethiopian Jews into Israel, the general director of the Israeli Ministry of Health was horrified. Nonetheless, it was considered that bringing these Jews into the country was something of a necessary evil, because otherwise, who was going to do most of the work? And while they were discriminated against, it's still important to note that they nonetheless enjoyed immense privileges at the cost of the Palestinians. To be a Jew in Israel, even one who was oppressed by other European Jews, still meant living at the expense of the Palestinians. And it still does today.
Who they were kicked the fuck out. Like, that's some sick shit. And that entire story, that entire culture is completely erased in this conversation where Jews are white people who just magically materialized in Israel.
Now, I want to respond to that before I go further in refuting the narrative of the mass expulsion, which is not true. Again, I want to go over it in detail. It's going to be the last part of this video, the last response that I do, because it is the most important part of this video. It's the one thing I have never spoken about on any of my channels, on YouTube or anything. One, when people say that Ethan Klein is a white Jew, we are saying that he is a white Jew, not that all Jews are white Jew. It doesn't really matter if you are white in Israel or if you have Arab ancestry, if you're an Arab Jew, it doesn't really matter. If you're an Ethiopian Jew, what does it matter, right? Israel is a Jewish supremacist state. Among Jews, there is certainly a racial hierarchy. Yep, absolutely, as I just went over. But racial states, and that is what Israel is, it is a racial state for Jewish people who the state conceives of and who many Jews themselves conceive of as being of a race or ethnicity. In Israel, the primary mode of oppression, of privilege given to people is based on their Jewishness, not on their whiteness. Colonialism is not justified if it's being done by a lot of people who are not white or who would not be considered white or whatever. I would hope that we can agree on that. Race and racial oppression is never the same everywhere. Anyone from Latin America, for example, who gets annoyed when Americans wade into conversations on racism in Latin America, talking about it as if it's exactly the same as their country, can back me up on that one. Things are never the same everywhere. And in Israel, while there is a racial hierarchy among Jews, it is fundamentally a Jewish supremacist state. And it is erroneous to call it a white supremacist one, even though there is a huge element of white supremacy among Jews within that state, because this is far surmounted by the notion of Jewish supremacy that is what really underpins it. Usually, when people mock white Israelis, we're talking about literal, actual European migrants, American migrants like Ethan Klein, who managed to migrate to Israel just because he was born Jewish, and mocking the absurd notion that people like this have a supposed right of return to go and live in a land that they were not born in, that they are not from, that they have no real connection to. While Palestinians are confined by one of the most advanced militaries in the world, backed by most of the richest states in the world, to the West Bank and Gaza, sometimes 500 meters away. Tel Aviv is like 50 kilometers away from Gaza. It is an absurd situation, and that's the point of mentioning the ridiculousness. The Zionist movement itself was also, as I went over earlier, as you could have derived from the context, sorry, that sounded a bit aggressive, as you may have derived from the context, a movement overwhelmingly of European Jews. To them, Arab, Eastern, Mizrahi Jews, whatever you want to call them, were an afterthought, a tool to be used for their national project. The movement was, in its vast majority, European. Up to the foundation of Israel, and for a long time after it as well, it was very much a European colonial initiative. In fact, it is very accurate to say that it still is, regardless of the ethnicity of many Israelis having Arab roots, because it is one that is informed by the history of European colonialism, by the European history of Zionism, and by the Israeli identity itself, which is very much based on European nationalism.
It's
Apparently all Jews are from Poland.
They're all from Poland. I don't know how to say this. The majority of Jews in Israel are from the Middle East.
Okay, so just a response to this point, because it is a very dumb point, and it plays into this idea that the Middle East is like one big country, and if you're from one part of it, you should have the right to go and steal someone else's house in another part of it. It doesn't matter if you're from Egypt, if you're from Yemen, you can do colonialism in Palestine. Palestine is not all of those other countries. Palestine is a different country. The Jewish community pre-Zionism in Palestine numbered around 20,000, if I'm remembering correctly. That there are people of your same religion or ethnicity living in a place also does not give you a magical right to move there and oppress the majority who are already there. So the relevance of this talking point is zero. Whether all Jews are from Poland or not, that does not make Israeli colonialism any more legitimate. And when we do talk about how they are from Poland, it is more than anything a point towards the fact that Israel is itself a colony in the vein of European colonialism. It is in fact the most recent European settler colony, and one of the last that is still in the 19th century stage of extermination, as this phase was already carried out in Australia, Canada, the USA, etc. in the 19th century. What you see in Gaza is the genocide of Aboriginal people, the genocide of Native Americans, except being carried out in the 21st century with 21st century technology by yet another European colonial project, which has its roots in Europe, in European colonial ideas, regardless of where the colonists come from, regardless of the fact that the colony was reinforced with Jews from Arab countries.
The majority, like 60%, And by the way, if it wasn't for anti-Semitism, most of them probably still live in the Arab world.
I mean, yeah, a lot of those families had to leave everything behind, just get up and go.
Total annihilation.
I mean,
Okay, that is simply not true. But as I went over earlier, where Israel Zionists always saw anti-Semitism as a boon for themselves, you can see there that Ethan and Hila at least kind of acknowledge this, which I guess is okay, good on them, but they don't acknowledge the key role that Israel played in intentionally stoking that anti-Semitism in the Arab world, and the fact that in many cases, they were not so simply expulsions. There was literally the Israelis making deals with these countries to get them to expel their Jews to Israel. Firstly, again, it's important to note that what's happened to Jews in these countries, in these Arab countries, is obviously not legitimate. It was obviously wrong and illegal. However, it was a reaction to the Israeli expulsion of Palestinians. It was a reaction to a unilateral Israeli declaration of independence, followed by expansion, an expansion which has continued ever since. Something which the people who were there beforehand had never agreed to, and which was obviously unjust to expect them to accept. Israel knew that there would be an adverse reaction against this in those countries, against the Jews who were there. They had been warned of it, yet they did it anyway. For two, they present this as like some sort of immediate expulsion, but it simply was not that. Jews leaving these countries happened over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. It was not like, okay, you do this to the Palestinians, we do this to you. In many cases, these countries tried desperately to keep Jews there. They banned immigration of Jews to Israel. They banned immigration of Jews. The Jewish Agency, one of the most important Israeli/Zionist organizations in the entire world, struck a deal with the French governors of Morocco, because Morocco was still a French colony at this time, to have 100,000 Jews forcibly deported to Israel. Many of them did not want to leave. They were essentially forced onto the boat. That's not an Arab expulsion of Jews. It is an Israeli-French expulsion of Jews. So this narrative that there was like this immediate unified expulsion is simply wrong. Every one of these countries was a different country. They reacted in different ways. Some of them did not want the Jews to leave, and Israel did everything possible to try to force them to leave. One interesting thing, for example, is that the top Jewish emissary in Yemen attempted to get the Yemenis to expel their Jews, and Israeli agents carried out false flag terrorist attacks across the Arab world, especially in Iraq, in an effort to convince the Jews there that anti-Semitism in their country had made their presence untenable. The Iraqi government did not want their Jews to leave. They outlawed Jewish emigration, and the Israeli government, with help from their American and British allies, pressured the Iraqi government to rescind that law, which they duly did. Israel did everything possible to force an exodus of Jews from the Arab world. For Israelis, 7-ish decades later, to now weaponize this is cynical. It was certainly a tragedy, but it was entirely caused by Israel out of their own disregard for Jewish safety in the rest of the world and their own complete disregard for the autonomy of individual Jews, individual Jewish communities, individual Jewish families elsewhere. They considered them as little more than tools for their colonial project and did everything possible to make their lives in their Middle Eastern homes, aside from Palestine, untenable. An extremely important thing as well is that Palestinians have always been conscious of this. Palestinian negotiators have always been adamant that Israel needs to discuss the matter of Jewish compensation or return to the lands that they were supposedly expelled from with those governments, because they are Palestinians. They are not responsible for what those governments did, and they cannot negotiate on their behalf, which is obviously self-evidently true. Another thing is that the Palestinian leadership has for a very long time been conscious of what these Arab Jews mean to the Israeli propaganda narrative. And in 1975, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, at the time the most important Palestinian organization, asked that the Arab nations from which these Jews were from issue a formal invitation to them to return and be given their assets back, or at least to receive compensation. None of them took them up on this offer. In contrast, the Israeli state has never, even once, even acknowledged the ownership of a single Palestinian who had been expelled from their land or home, let alone offered to give it back to them. And this is because this entire narrative of Jewish expulsion, the false narrative of mass Jewish expulsion, because while there were expulsions, obviously it was not characterized solely by expulsions. There was a lot of forced migration induced by Israel, some expulsions and then some voluntary migration, is bullshit, because the Israelis don't actually care about this. For them, it is a rhetorical tool that they solely bring up in response to the Palestinian right of return. The Israeli government itself is very careful of this, because they know that if they start talking seriously and openly about this Jewish right to return to other Middle Eastern countries, that legitimizes the Palestinian one. And the Palestinian right of return is what they want to prevent, because these people don't want to go back. You know, they're living at large in Israel at the expense of Palestinians. Why would they want to go and be given like their grandparents or their great-grandparents' land back in Iraq or something? On the other hand, the Palestinians desperately need their land. They have no other land. They have no other assets. They have no other place to go. So for Israel, this is a rhetorical tool that they use. Though the government itself doesn't really use it, it's mostly Zionists not operating in an official capacity who like to bring it up. In the 1990s, when the Israelis started paying more attention to this rhetorical strategy, they investigated pushing these claims during the so-called peace process that was going on then, and decided against doing so, or even trying to do like any sort of serious investigation into how much Jewish property had been lost, how much it was worth, and pushing the countries that were involved for compensation for it, because they were worried about the precedent that would set, which would allow Palestinians to do the same regarding Israel. The Israeli state in 1999 even forcibly dismantled the agency that it had set up to represent Arab Jews in their claims for their land and compensation from other Middle Eastern countries, because the organization took on a life of its own and tried to secure equal representation among it for the 1 million Middle Eastern Jews who don't live in Israel. They simply didn't actually care. For them, they set up this organization as just sort of a know you. And once it became its own thing that no longer suited their interests, they got rid of it. So it is a dishonest narrative. They don't really care about this. It is something that they bring up and frame in a completely dishonest, bullshit way that erases a ton of the history, erases a ton of what actually happened, solely to push back on Palestinians who are attempting to claim their own right to return to the land that Israel and Israelis stole from them. The narrative, as Ethan Klein did there, requires an erasure of the Nakba to really function properly, and it requires a historical denial of what actually happened afterwards to the Jews in the Middle East, a whole lot of which was imposed upon them by Israel, because the full story is not one of reciprocal expulsions that can be compared at all. It is the Zionists and then the Israelis, after they declared independence, implementing a long-held plan to expel the Palestinians, and then also implementing measures to encourage the Middle Eastern Jews to emigrate to Israel, combined with limited expulsions which themselves only happened as a reaction to what the Israelis first did to the Palestinians, which began before they had declared independence and before the intervention of the Arab states. We need to ask here, if Israel seriously wants to press these claims for Jewish or Israeli property in these Arab countries, well, these Arab countries have been attempting to normalize relations with Israel for decades now. If anything, they are subservient to Israel and its European American allies. Yet Israel, in these negotiations, has never tried to press them for the return of Jewish property and for the right of return for Jews who had, or descendants of Jews who had left these countries. You know why that is? Because Israel doesn't care, because Zionists don't care. For them, this is a tool. Just like they use the Holocaust as a rhetorical tool to somehow legitimize the oppression, the killing, the massacre, the theft of land from Palestinians who had nothing to do with it, to the point that Netanyahu claims that Hitler only wanted to kill Jews because he was convinced by a Palestinian. In the exact same vein, this narrative of the mass expulsion of the Arab Jews is presented as the initiative of like some unified Arab consciousness where all Arabs or all Middle Easterners are responsible for what is done by any country, even though when you actually look at the facts, these things happen differently in many different countries. In many countries, there was no mass expulsion. In many countries, the Israelis did everything they possibly could to force the Jews out themselves. And this sort of homogenization serves to somehow blame this on the Palestinians and thus cynically utilize Jewish historical oppression to legitimize current Jewish supremacy and the horrific consequences of this that we are seeing presently clear as day in Gaza. That's all I wanted to talk about here. I figured that I could use this as another sort of teaching moment, though I know that these people just are not really interested in being taught themselves, but hopefully someone else, you know, maybe you guys didn't know about this stuff. Because at the end of the day, you have to understand that that narrative is legitimizing what is happening right now. That narrative is legitimizing decades upon decades of Palestinian oppression. That is what it was created to serve, and that is what it still serves today. And they are like 39, 40 years old. They do not have any excuse. They've been surrounded by people like Hassan, who have doubtlessly told them all about a lot of the things that have gone over here. They have no excuse for still presenting a narrative that erases the Nakba and presents all of these events in such a clearly biased way, and in a way that has been used and that is used to justify the oppression and massacre of the Palestinian people by Israel and the denial of them their legitimate rights. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for watching. This will probably be my last video on this for a little while because it is a lot of work to do this stuff, even though you might not realize it is a lot of work to gather your thoughts on this, get it all out at once, edit it all together, upload it in a fairly short period of time. Though it is at least a lot faster than I usually make my videos, so maybe I should do this sort of off-the-cuff sort of thing more about topics that I'm already well-versed on. Anyway, I hope this helps someone, and free Palestine. Ethan Klein, apologize to the Yemeni kid who you call a terrorist, please. Thank you. And for that matter, apologize to everyone you deplatform and everything else. Thank you. Bye.